Hello, heathens and heretics. This is Lilith. I'm here with Renee of Revelation, and we are Veritas Voices. I hope you're all doing well this week. I know it's been a little trying. We're all at home with COVID and perhaps a little bit stressed. I know it's, it's having a bit of a toll on everyone's mental health. So I hope you're taking time to take care of yourself. Do some self-care, do something nice for you. We need to come out the other side of this and be there for each other. So, in that note, how are you, Renee?
I am doing good so far at the moment. I'm looking forward to this episode and yeah.
Yeah, me too. Oh, thanks for putting up with the slight delay, although it won't matter to our listeners. There was a slight delay with recording, partly because of a piece of news that Renee noticed, which is the death of Ravi Zacharias. He was a Christian apologist, Canadian of Indian descent, who started an apologetic ministry. And I have to say, on reviewing his work, although I clearly don't agree with his conclusions in any way, how can you put this? I object to him far less than to the majority of other apologists. I do not find him to be, I find his arguments to be a little old and tired, but I do not find him to be remotely near as dishonest as I've found so many others. I think that he clearly advocated that truth was the most important thing in this pursuit of knowledge. And while, again, I have many rational objections to the way he went about that, I can at least respect that he was not trying to be dishonest, which is something we see far, far, far too much in this game. And it leads into what we were planning on talking about this week, which is truth. What is it? Why do we value it? Renee and I connected on that as one of the first things, that we consider truth to be the most important thing. And that is a feeling everyone does not necessarily share.
Yeah. I would say in general it's also important to lay out how we feel about truth or how we feel about honesty, because honesty obviously ties into truth, and how we approach people who are sort of lying to us, people whom we trust, people whom we may even consider friends, and at what point we would consider them dishonest or disloyal. Because as far as I'm concerned, and I think that's the stance that you agree with me, is that if a person whom I trust, who may be a friend, who may be just an expert that I put stock in, if I catch such person lying to me or deceiving me, then I immediately cannot trust that person any further. One lie for me is sufficient, and at that point, with
You're
a
out.
friend, trust and loyalty is no longer possible for me, and with an expert, I can't believe a thing they say anymore. How do you feel about that?
I think I would agree. I would give one tentative thing. I would want to know, how intentional was the deceit? Was it a case of a mistaken opinion that they then dug their heels in on? And also, what were the circumstances? I am naturally a very black and white thinker, and I was raised evangelical, so there's no acceptable time to lie, ever, 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 ever. And it disabled me kind of, because there are times when you need to kind of gloss over something, quite innocently, perhaps. Of course, we're not throwing you a surprise party. Telling that sort of a lie became an issue of guilt for me. So I want to know the circumstances. But yes, in the case of a relationship, once someone has deliberately lied to you, that trust is damaged. And while you may be able to rebuild a level of trust, it will never have not happened. In the case of an expert, although because this is where you have to tell Christians that no, a fallacy is an appeal to authority, just blanket and absolute. And if you're good at something, then you know everything. Like when they try and stick what they think are profound sounding quotes in Einstein's mouth because, his work in physics makes him an expert in metaphysics or not, but that it's valid to quote an authority on a subject if that is their subject. But even then, it's not absolute. If an expert has been lying, though, then yeah, absolutely. Whatever their motivation, and I think especially in the case of quoting experts and researching and things, you have to be very unforgiving.
Yeah.
Because if someone is willing to bend the truth once, they're willing to do it again. And the point of research is to discover the truth, and the truth is a very hard thing. It's reality. Now, have you ever sat down and thought about how to define truth?
My personal definition of truth would be pretty much the definition of truth with which most people use, which is truth is that which corresponds to reality. But I also one thing which I also want to mention, as far as experts or as far as trusted people go, and I think this may be a unique stance for me, but I still think it's a correct stance. As far as I'm concerned, the more that I would trust an expert, the more that I would put stock into that expert, or again, the same with friendship.
Mm-hmm.
The more I put stock into it, the more I expect loyalty and truth and honesty from them, the less forgiving I would be when I discovered that there would be a lie involved. Like,
Yeah. And that's something that I think, the more we've invested in someone or something, the greater the sense of betrayal. And far too often that will lead people to a bad loyalty, to remaining loyal to someone who has lied to them because of the sunk cost fallacy, because they've already invested, which
that's
is unfortunate.
but that's for me where, and again, we agree there because we both value truth very much and we both value honesty very much. When I feel betrayed by someone, I don't go back, and I have no choice but to face the truth. I have no choice but to accept the circumstance, and I then have no choice to, as much as it would hurt me, to then remove that person out of my life, because once trust is damaged, it's over. At least that's my stance, but I also think it's yours because I know you.
Yeah. Well, you're not wrong. I do take a very firm stance on that thing. I think I do. Again, I've had to learn moderation in these things, whereas other people have to learn to be more stringent. So I've I found it important to look at the distinction between a lie and a statement which is false. I'll give you an example. My
Yeah,
parents raised me as a young earth creationist. This is something which is manifestly
false.
false. There is no way in the universe that it is true. It's completely absurd. Every conceivable line of evidence in the universe, um, including even if you accept the Bible as some sort of an authority, all of the best and most thorough biblical research and exegesis and the highest scholarship, all refute this.
Yeah,
It's obviously false. However, I know that they did not lie to me. They told me a thing that was false, but they did not know that it was false. Maybe they should have.
that what you're meaning to say there was no intention of betrayal, there was no intention of deceit, like,
Yeah, it
for
wasn't a deceit. They were deceived and passed that deception on. And that's far too often what happens.
for instance,
Um,
if I were to accidentally give you false information, then you would say, well, okay, that's false information, but you meant well, you didn't mean to deceive me, you were
And
just
that doesn't necessarily remove all responsibility from you. I may need to confront you and say, look, you need to apply a higher standard of evidence and do more research before you give me information. But it's not the same as lying. And I, I'm you can take into account a person's intentions without necessarily letting them totally off the hook, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
yeah,
I have to say, getting back to like your definition of truth, I have to agree. My favorite person to go to for definitions is Aaron Ra, because he's so good about laying out clear definitions. Truth is that which is concordant with reality. The truth is what the facts are. Facts are points of data that are not disputable because they're independently verifiable. I mean, you could dispute if you're going to be dishonest, but you actually care, you can go check. The old, do you see the wall? Do you believe it's there? If you don't believe it's there, go walk into it until you're convinced it's there. um, and that's, I think, one of the most important things in life. The way we learn at first and the way we have to continue to learn is that when you're working on a false idiom, when you have a bad idea of the world, an incorrect idea of the world, life isn't going to work right. You're going to keep running into problems because you're working with a map that doesn't match the train you're on. But I still have to say, my favorite version of that definition is just a little more snarky. And you know me, I love my snark.
yeah,
Right? It's that reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away.
yeah. That's accurate, and I think that also that pretty much is also yeah uh, the pretty much the reality thing. Like reality is independent of our minds. It's
Yep,
what we believe does affect it. It is what it is, and it is ours to figure out through our senses and through the evidence and through the data.
absolutely. And a lot of people who have been converted by experiences of the divine or spiritual or numinous experiences that they were then given an explanation that fitted certain theology and it worked for them. The thing is, that's one of the things about God is that when you stop, they keep telling me, oh, he doesn't go away because you stop believing in him. And I'm kind of going, as someone who's lived both sides of that argument, he does.
Yeah.
Sorry to tell you, I
Yeah. So
stopped believing and he's gone. Poof, poof,
yeah.
poof, poof.
Just like this famous or sort of the reversal of in the beginning God created man. It's actually the other way around.
In
In
the
the beginning
beginning,
man
man
God.
created God. Yeah, in his image and likeness, sexist, misogynistic, and racist.
Yeah.
Which,
So I've
yeah,
sort of one occasion made an argument on Twitter, which I personally don't buy into, but it was like everything which begins to exist has a cause. God began to exist. God has a cause. That causes our minds.
well, I can't speak for the soundness of the argument, but I do agree with the conclusion. So,
Personally, I would reject premise one of the argument that everything which begins to exist has a cause, but
well,
that's
yeah, that's the whole. Uh,
column.
well, yeah, we know the Kalam, the messed up Kalam. But we have better things to talk about. Interestingly enough, the value of truth as being the most important thing to pursue is something that I continue to find in a lot of atheists, especially former believers, that this is a very powerful value for them. And in the case of former believers like myself, being taught this completely false version of the world, even if unintentional, even if, the people who taught us were not necessarily deliberately lying, we get very angry. It pisses one off to find out one has been lied to one's whole life. It's It's not a positive thing. Still a lot of Christians who seem to be like, oh, well, how come you're upset? And I'm like, seriously? You're seriously asking me that?
And
Right.
that's especially also the thing that I find problematic with apologetics, because one of the first thing that I did when I became an atheist was I watched a debate between Christopher Hitchens and Frank Turek. Like, was this
I've seen that one. Sorry. Please go ahead. But just, yeah, go
one?
on.
And while I did in the end think that Christopher Hitchens won, like Frank Turek did make some arguments that at least at face value, I was thinking, well, okay, those aren't actually too unreasonable. I don't accept them, but they're not too unreasonable. And then I started also to dig more into the Kalam argument, and I got also into counter apologetics and that sort of
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And then I learned how much of a shitbag Frank Turek is and how much of shitbag these other apologists are, and that they're lying to people and that they know that they're lying to people. And at that point, the initial charisma that Frank Turek had for me, it immediately vanished, and it became almost hatred and anger that or it didn't almost become hatred and anger, it became hatred and anger that he gets paid to lie to people.
Yeah. Well, that was the first thing that got me blocked by Ken Ham. I just wrote to him, "How does it feel to lie to children for a living?"
Yeah,
Um, and that's the case. Truly, and sometimes it's not even that hard to discover. A lot of Christian apologists seem to find William Lane Craig very engaging, and atheists just facepalm because his arguments are extremely poor, and Christians don't see that. But his dishonesty manifests in other ways. He, for example, for the longest time would refuse to debate with anyone who didn't have a degree in philosophy, which I believe Theoretical Bullshit, also known as Scott Clifton, the actor, is he and Paula G are the only ones that don't have a philosophy degree that Craig has deigned to respond to my knowledge. But he would treat people, with great disdain. And yet he will speak about things he knows nothing about. He will promote creationism, talking about biology in a way that's incredibly ignorant, talking about physics. I believe Lee Strobel, Lee Strobel wrote The Case for Christ.
yeah, I know.
Yeah, and just for our audience, incredibly softball. He's like, he pretends to be this tough reporter, and he asks one toughish question, then he just softballs everything forever after, and takes every answer as gospel and received truth without doing any additional, counterpoints. It's really sad. But then he wrote A Case for a Creator, which is supposed to be about the scientific case for God, which is a large case of argument from ignorance and incredulity. But it's 11 chapters long, and he doesn't speak to anyone who has anything to do with science until the 7th chapter. And I believe that William Lane Craig was interviewed on a chapter about physics. William
Yeah,
Lane Crane knows dick about physics.
yeah,
He has at best he might have picked up some things from Sean Carroll engaging in debates with physicists and so forth, because that's about it. And I very much doubt he did, because he doesn't seem to tend to listen to anyone who knows what they're talking about.
yeah,
So that kind of demonstrable dishonesty in talking about things he knows nothing about, continuing to make the same point after it's been rebutted without ever addressing battles, and then you know yeah, it's very much a double standard in behavior, and it does undermine his credibility. If he
yeah,
had some evidence to bring to the table, I would still look at it, but I don't trust the argumentation of someone who is so demonstrably dishonest.
yeah. And one thing which I would say also to that is that many Christians will defend William Lane Craig to the death. Like his arguments that the apologetic in itself has, to my mind, also become a sort of dogma for them because, and I don't find them, at least for a person who wants to be a Christian, who wants to be a committed Christian, who can't give up his Christian theism from that perspective, I don't actually find that unreasonable because I think they too realize that if William Lane Craig is lying to them, if the arguments are wrong, if the arguments are bad, and William Lane Craig would actually know that they are wrong and that they are bad, then
Well, and this is another
much
case
better
of
about the position that he's defending, and then they can't trust him anymore, and then they would have to question everything immediately. Everything is said and
and
everything that
I
other
think
politics say.
it's a very bad idea to wrap your ideas up in allegiance to a person. Um, there's a great emotional appeal to that, but it's very unwise. Um, if you're trying to get yourself totally tied up in knots and basically tie your allegiance to the idea of God or not God or anything to a single individual, then everything gets tangled up and you're incapable of being honest and objective. And I think that's a really bad thing. For example, I admire Christopher Hitchens greatly. I find many of his arguments to be brilliant. However, if you show me that he was wrong about something, that's not going to make me a Christian because I don't have the relationship with him of, an idol or a guru or something.
Yeah,
This is often something that Christians seem to mistake, is that when we quote an atheist or someone, we may just be using their quote because they've worded something very well. We aren't appealing to them as an absolute authority of reality. I
yeah,
mean, like I said, Aaron Ra's definitions are extremely well and clearly stated, and I find that incredibly useful when talking about an idea. It doesn't mean he's God or something equivalent.
yeah. I mean, as as far as I know, Christopher Hitchens did have. I don't recall what ideas that I've come across that I didn't like from him, but I do think that something about a war that he promoted,
The
which
war in Iraq, yeah.
yeah, that personally I found disagreeable, but
Although I
it
will say his ideas given for a good sight better than anybody else's arguments for it. He at least had
yeah,
brought some good reasons to defense of his position. But that,
but let's
again,
say
what else would you expect of him?
yeah, but let's say that I did hold to a philosophical argument that one of the atheist YouTubers made, and I later found out that the atheist YouTuber knew that the argument wasn't sound. Then at that point, that would definitely make me that would make me question this YouTuber as a reliable source, and that would
Yeah.
also make me, in a way, reconsider their sort of rebuttals that they had to other arguments that Christian apologists presented. At
Yeah.
least that would be the
You
case
you
for me.
assess the idea separate from the person, but if you find a person to be dishonest, they cease to become a reliable source for ideas. And
You need
that's
to evaluate.
reasonable. People who lie are not good sources of truth.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's in fairness. I've yeah, I that was one of the things that bothered me about Christianity because even when I was a Christian and I did engage in apologetics, or well, I engaged in reading and assessing apologetics, but even still I realized that this could not give an absolute proof of God. It could perhaps take you to the position that belief in God was not irrational and that there was, some sort of support for it. But it wasn't a case of just, yeah, again, it certainly wasn't absolute or flawless. And I knew even then that it would not be able to move someone from the position of I don't buy this, to I am now convinced of this.
Yeah. And one thing that I would also say, which might sound again a little bit weird, but I do think that it's true. If you sort of believed in God purely because of the Kalam argument, and you haven't yet examined it in depth and are convinced that it is a reasonable argument, the conclusion follows, and that sort of stuff, then I do think that your belief in God would not be unreasonable. But once you have obviously detected the refutations and the flaws, and you still believe in God, even though your basis for belief in God is now removed, then you are unreasonable.
Well, and it's a journey. People don't give up something that they've been basing their thought processes on for a long time just willy-nilly. You can't, because you got to find your feet. And I think we need to be a little more reasonable about a comparative burden of proof. To simply reject the God idea as such, we have no burden of proof until they meet an evidential burden of proof that, you know, would then flip it to us to refute. Believers haven't done that. They've offered a lot of miracle claims, a lot of very convoluted reasoning, but nothing, nothing reliable. Not like
Yeah,
science, as I say. Science does not require faith. It doesn't want prayers. It gave me an iPhone. Results results are good. But I can understand that on an individual basis, there is a certain amount of a burden of proof to overcoming this person. If this person has a mindset that is false, um, that's still a frame of reference for them. They
yeah,
can't just throw that out and then what? Just be free floating agents in the universe until they figure out, like, no, you kind of have to keep your feet on something, while you're figuring out what to move to, what way is the best way. And I think sometimes we're a bit unreasonable about expecting people to just jettison beliefs the instant that they're become problematic, without taking into consideration that, maybe they're interwoven with other beliefs and they've got a whole network here, and they have to do some readjustment that takes a bit of time. It's not as simple as just, okay, well, that's bullshit.
yeah.
On to the new. Um,
That is actually true. Like all of our beliefs pretty much exist in a sort of network, and like for instance, if I would have to, or if someone wanted to give me an argument for the resurrection, which I don't at all find convincing, but they would have to overcome an entire network of beliefs, namely that the belief that there is no existent entity that can raise people from the dead, that people in general don't get raised from the dead, that the odds a priori against people being raised from the dead are incalculable to one.
well, and if we're talking about something like the Lazarus effect, which, in fairness, happens more often with people with sailors and fishermen, in especially cold waters where they essentially appear to be dead and then they revive later. Um, or in some cases, like their heart actually stops, but they've sort of gone into this almost hibernative mode. And anyway, so yeah, there's been some interesting occurrences like that. And I could, consider something like that. But the whole idea of miracles is that they're impossible. Like, that's by definition, miracles are impossible. They are violations of the laws of nature, not an aspect of the laws of nature that we haven't figured out yet. There's lots of that. How do we um, how do we make general relativity and quantum mechanics work together? How do we marry them? How do we bridge the gap? Nobody knows. Um, but that doesn't mean there isn't a way to do it. We just don't know that. And
Yeah,
so it's not miraculous, it's merely unknown. And a lot of people, and that's where you get into arguments from ignorance, but that's not. It's funny because a lot of Christians will, they try to link this with the undermining of morality or logic. They try and found morality and logic and truth in God. And so when we reject God because we value truth, it makes their brains explode.
Yeah.
Um,
To a degree, obviously that's understandable when you have sort of made this mental link inside your brain to, well, you can't be moral without God, and you then say, well, I don't need God to be moral. Then that's to them a sort of contradiction in terms.
well, and they may think that you can do it, but only because, you know, God's spirit resides within you as part of the created world or something like that. You end up with this sort of post hoc rationalizations because in many cases you're looking at defining all of these things that are conceptual as being somehow spiritual and numinous.
Yeah.
And that's where they won't it's a pretty good hint that they're getting into bullshit territory, is that they won't lock down a clear and useful definition.
Yeah.
We talked about Aaron Ra. He gives the definition of, you know, truth is what the facts are. Facts are independently verifiable points of data. Those are very clear definitions. You can use them. You can determine what is true and not true. It doesn't require any kind of grand metaphysical entity. It's just, this is a cup. Is it a cup? I can feel it's a cup. I can see it's a cup. I can pour liquid into it and drink the liquid out of it, so it's a cup.
Yeah.
We have established this. Anyone who doubts me can try and drink out of the cup. Ideally, they'll wash it first, especially now. But it's an independently verifiable point of data.
Yeah.
Christian apologists especially tend to work from very vague definitions, unclear numinous, and the idea that somehow truth or morality only makes sense if they are based in a concept of authority.
Yeah. And that's also something that I want to bring up, because using the sort of definitions that they use are not laying out what the actual argument is, because if you were to take a look at the Kalam argument, which they say is a very simple, very easy argument for God, if you actually get down to the definitions of what the Kalam argument would metaphysically commit you to, and what scientific positions the Kalam argument would commit you to, as far as theories of time goes, as far as causation goes, as far as everything goes, it's not a simple argument at all. It's a
No.
very complicated argument that commits you to numerous positions in science, and that's also something. When you discover this, I cannot imagine how you can trust a person who says, well, it's a simple argument for God, when they know it's not a simple argument for God. And when you then see, okay, they are being purposefully vague because...
Well, and they, in fairness, these things have been held as if they were these numinous metaphysical properties that required an authority to function for a very long time. It's an old tradition within thought that a lot of us don't think about.
Yeah.
And we need to point out that actually authority is the weakest basis for anything. And this has been something that Christian apologists have been making excuses about since Augustine. If you just read a couple of the church fathers, go as far back as you want, you'll get all these excuses for how, well, of course, human authority is the weakest basis of all arguments, but divine authority is the highest basis for all arguments, even though The only claim you have for divine authority rests on human authority. A person said, God told me so.
Yeah. I
A
mean, what
person said, a miracle was performed that confirms that God told me so.
Yeah. I mean, what I just want to say about my last point is that also using vague language that you can then use to weasel out of scrutiny with equivocations or goalpost shifting, that is also a form of dishonesty, and that is also a form of deception, and that's what many apologists are guilty of.
True. I would say that the only authority I require is physical reality.
Yeah.
We interact with physical reality. We can tell what's real because we literally bump into it. That's induction, and fine, you can quibble about the problem of induction if you want, but ultimately, that's the only authority I need. The observable universe exists.
And we can,
I'm going to I literally have no other way of existing save to interact with it all day every day, the
yeah,
entirety of my life. So yes, I'm going to take that as, if you need it, an authority. Also because physics doesn't know how to lie.
yeah,
People do. Just saying.
it's true.
Mm, I have to say, I was looking at Ravi Zacharias' stuff, and I think he was, well, for an apologist, comparatively honest. Um,
Well, what I would say to that, as a point of information, is I haven't seen many of his things, but I have in the past read an article where he was quoted a few times as with apologetic quotes, and there was one quote I don't remember it exactly, which I found to be profoundly dishonest on his part. But I'm not an expert on Ravi Zacharias, but I do think that he probably isn't much better than the other apologists that we've mentioned.
so one of the ways I found Ravi Zacharias more honest than other apologists, which I grant you is not a very high bar, is that at least he did appear to be honest about other people's positions. He would give a reasonably accurate assessment of Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam, not um, ways in which they were similar to Christianity or unique from. And he wasn't quite so willing to just make up silly straw men about opponent positions, unlike a lot of others. And this is again why I said honesty in apologetics is not a high bar. I you sent I know this isn't a tweets episode, but there was one tweet by Frank Turek that I think we both responded to. Um, and atheists admit that the universe began to exist out of nothing. Since there's evidence for the greatest miracle in the Bible, then all other miracles are at least possible. And I mean, it was interesting to watch the replies because there was so much anger at the dishonesty of confusing atheism and science and lying about what science says and lying about what atheists admit, and like literally everything not true. None of that is true that he said.
Yeah, but it's a common talking point among apologists.
It's
Let's
true.
say it's not the first time I've heard him use it, nor is it the first time I've heard other people use it.
Oh, no, no. I've heard very similar things from many apologists. And I think that one of the things I found most frustrating when I was a Christian, I found most frustrating in my deconversion, and I find most frustrating now, is the way that apologists lie about their opponent's position in order to set themselves up for success. And I have to say, it was one of the things that led to my deconversion. Because if I had the truth, why were the people who were so strongly advocating for the importance of truth on the other side?
That's something that you always have to ask yourself.
It's true. Sometimes it's not a conclusive argument, but sometimes it is wise to look around at the company you're keeping and think about if you might be missing something and if that's the sort of company you want to keep.
Yeah,
And if it isn't, maybe you're missing some information. Just be open to the possibility. Not saying, commit moral ad hominem fallacies, but just be aware. That can be a signpost on the way to discovering where you've been mistaken. Oh, but I hope you don't mind. I think that's about all we can cover for today. Are you satisfied with that, Renee?
yeah, I'm all good.
Thank you. Well, as you know, folks, next week is Tweets from Batshit Believers. I think I may have stolen some of our material. So you must help us. You must send us suggestions. What will we do without you? I guess we can always hit up Pastor Mark, but Driscoll, but come
Yeah,
on. I'm sure you can find some fun and interesting crazy this week. It's there's always something new. In any event, thank you for your time and understanding, Renee. Thank you to all our listeners. Please reach out to us at Veritas Voices, at Phoenix_Lilith, and at Renevelation on Twitter. Um, Reach out to support us through my Patreon so we can get some better equipment and expand um, our programs and options. And until next week, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and reason bless.